Hello and welcome to today's webinar. If you require any technical assistance, please phone Redback Support on 1-800-733-416. If you would like to listen to this webinar through your phone instead, please dial in the number and passcode in the grey bar below. Today, the AAA presents Pavement Maintenance for Regional Airports. This webinar is the final of a series focused on airport pavements for regional airports. This webinar will look at types of maintenance, typical maintenance activities, surface options and life expectancy, and approaches to maintenance contracting. The opportunity to ask questions will also be provided. To ask Greg a question, please use the navy hand icon on the top right-hand side of your screen. Questions will be answered throughout the webinar. Before we start, I would like to take the opportunity to thank Greg for his time today and also in preparing for this webinar. I would also like to take this opportunity to provide you with a couple of updates from the AAA. AAA National Conference is only 11 weeks away. Don't forget to register your attendance to expand your network, develop your knowledge, and be inspired through a range of speaker sessions and interactive panel discussions. Airport Safety Week, taking place from Monday the 14th to Friday the 18th of October. Further details will be released soon. Without any further ado, let's begin the webinar.
Good morning. Hi to you all. Thanks, as we've got 30 odd out there, so that's never a bad thing. Regional airport pavement maintenance. So, as per the introduction, this is the last in a series of webinars focused on airport pavements for regional airports. Really built around Airport Practice Note number 12, Airfield Pavement Essentials, which interestingly, even though it's only been around a year or two now, it'll probably be revamped after the new MOS is released. So there's a little exercise that the AAA is going through at the moment, getting ready to have all of its practice notes reviewed or updated to reflect the new MOS requirements once they're locked down and officially published, whenever that might be, last year, this year, next year, whenever that happens. Anyway, today we'll talk a bit about maintenance and what the MOS says about maintenance, the current MOS that is, different types of maintenance, what we commonly do on sealed, unsealed and asphalt pavement surfaces, again with a focus on regional airports rather than capital city airports, although many of the principles are the same. Any questions, ask them as we go along. If we don't catch them as we're going, we'll try and revisit them at the end. So in terms of what the MOS says about maintenance, there is a section 10.15 of the current MOS, and that'll probably stay largely intact, but it'll have a different number. Really says that your airfield pavements should be free from FOD, and really there are lots of different sources of FOD, but the ones that we're interested in from a pavement perspective are really loose stones on the surface. Compliant skid resistance, and we've talked about skid resistance in the past on these webinars as being either surface texture, surface friction, or adequate and effective grooves. So the three different ways you can meet skid resistance regulation. Free from undulation, so that the pavement is free draining and that there are no bumps or hollows that might cause handling issues to aircraft. And in the case of unsealed pavements, be free from cracks wider than 40 millimetres, which sounds pretty large to me, or stones bigger than 25 millimetres. So clearly with an unsealed pavement, you're not going to be completely free of stones, so they just put a limit on the size of the stones. In terms of types of maintenance that we might commonly expect on our regional airports, so you can break maintenance down in lots of different ways, but I think about it as regulatory maintenance. So things that you have to do to ensure that you're still meeting your regulatory obligations. So if you're a runway that relies on friction, or skid resistance compliance, then how often are you going to do your skid resistance test or your friction test to demonstrate that you're still meeting that regulatory requirement? So it's not really maintenance as such, it's more of an action to demonstrate that you don't need to do some maintenance. Routine maintenance like crack sealing and those kinds of things, and the periodic maintenance. So things that happen every few years or once every now and then, and that could be in an asphalt surface, that could be some kind of rejuvenation or preservation. On a heavily used asphalt surface, it could be rubber removal from the touchdown zones. Probably more likely in regional airports, it's going to be reline marking every 2, 3, 4, 5, however many years, based on the level of usage and the amount of rubber being deposited. How often you do those things is very dependent on the pavement in question, and really what I've tried to highlight in there is that from a pavement maintenance perspective, I wouldn't be thinking about rehabilitation either due to flooding or to gross overloading, and I wouldn't be thinking of upgrades for larger aircraft in the maintenance space either. It might be upgrades or reconstructions or rehabilitations as opposed to the sort of normal maintenance that airports might be asked to action largely on their own. Just in terms of some of the common maintenance activities, things that happen at all airports, use surface sweeping. That's probably a common one, whether it be with a FOD boss or a vacuum sweeper or a tractor broom, and line marking, probably the most common form of maintenance on a regional airport. Can be done internally. Some airports do it internally, like the picture there. Actually, my friend Kenny from Dubbo. They run their own machine for most of the time, or externally by a specialist provider, and there's a range of them around. Always worth noting that redoing your lines is easy. Changing your lines is quite a different exercise because you can't just follow the lines you've got. And of course, we do those things essentially on an as-required basis. Skid resistance verification. In a practical sense, it's probably only required at regional airports when you resurface. I think we all acknowledge that the existing moss isn't overly clear in terms of when and how often and what with, in terms of some of the skid resistant stuff. But the new moss, I think, is a lot tighter and a lot clearer and a lot easier to understand about what you need to do when you rebuild a new pavement or resurface a pavement, and then what you have to do to demonstrate ongoing compliance through the life of that surface or that pavement. And again, it talks about friction testing, which is really an asphalt issue primarily, but it can happen on spray sealed runways. Probably more commonly, if you have the luxury of having an asphalt surface with grooves, then really are your grooves still adequate? That is, are they still full, or the whole volume of the groove is available and it's not filled with contamination like rubber buildup? That's really, tick. And then surface texture, and that's primarily going to be around spray seals. So I've built my new seal. I'm going to check it to make sure I've got my 1 millimetre surface texture that I would expect of a new surface. And then am I going to monitor that on an ongoing basis? Probably not, because visually I'll be able to tell if that 1 millimetre has been compromised. But there may be circumstances, and at some point during that surface's life, you might go back and have another check just to make sure that 1 millimetre hasn't been compromised by flushing or something like that. Occasionally, a few regional airports have had to do this to actually remove, well, I've said rubber removal, but it's more likely in a regional case to be flushed bitumen removal. If you're going to go down the path of either removing rubber or flushed bitumen, you've just got to be careful that you don't accidentally damage the underlying surface. But again, that's something that I think I've done it or been directly involved in it maybe half a dozen times in 15 years. So it's not the kind of thing that happens on a regular basis, although it does happen from time to time. There's a friction testing device on the left to demonstrate that you've got your friction, but unless you've got asphalt and it's ungrooved and you're relying on friction to demonstrate compliance or skid resistance. That's probably unlikely. A sand patch test on the right-hand side. So that's the kind of thing that might become more common at regional airports under the new MOS. A little sand patch of known volume spread out. You measure the diameter, and you can calculate a surface texture from that. And as I said, that'll probably become a bit more common, particularly after resurfacing or resealing, I should say, an existing pavement. Big machine on the left there is a rubber removing machine, which we also use for flushed bitumen removal. There's a number of different machines. That's just the one I had a photo of, and the photo doesn't show it very well, but you can see in the bottom right-hand corner there is a surface where that has been done and where it hasn't been done, so side-by-side surface. You can see how it restores the original surface appearance to your asphalt runways. We'll talk a little bit more later on about using a similar kind of device to remove flushed seal. And then, of course, resurfacing. We'll have to resurface from time to time. In terms of resurfacing a regional airport, the most likely is going to be a reseal, either a 1 or a 2 coat. We've talked about this before on these webinars as well, the importance of designing and building reseals like their runways, not like their roads, and the importance of doing them in the nice high, dry and hot weather to get the best out of those surfaces. Asphalt overlay, 6 to 10 times more expensive than a reseal, typically in that order, and it'll last you somewhere between 1.5, maybe 2 times as long, depending on how well the surface is done. So you've got to, as a regional airport, you've got to be reasonably lucky, I suppose, to have an asphalt surface. Certainly many benefits, but the 6 to 10 times more expensive limits their use, particularly in the regional areas where there are often not large asphalt plants capable of constructing those. So there's a lot of cost then, additional costs required to mobilise a big asphalt plant to site in those remote regional areas. I mentioned microsurfacing in there as well. It's relatively new compared to the other two. It's got some really good advantages. It's also got some limitations. There's been a bit of discussion lately about some kind of assessment about the pros and cons of all 3 of those treatments for regional airport resurfacing. So hopefully that's something that we'll tackle at the university next year. The aim being to provide a bit of guidance to people on those 3 options, what their pros and cons are, and a little bit of track record around some of the issues that have been experienced with some of those treatments and the others, so that people can make that decision a little bit more informed in the future. In terms of unsealed airport pavements, not a lot of maintenance to do, as you'd expect. Remove the large stones. There's been a few examples lately where the base course isn't a nice crushed base course. It's really just a whole bunch of fine material with some great big cobbles, sort of fist-sized rocks. And as the fine material erodes, the big rocks come out, and so they can either be hand-picked or swept up. Every now and then we might put a bit of top-up material down, so just a bit of extra base course, water, compact it, and then cut it back to grade to keep a nice shape in the surface, and to prevent those big cobbles in that underlying gravel from being exposed. And that's it as far as I'm aware in terms of unsealed pavements. In terms of the sealed pavements, crack sealing is obviously common. Best done with a rubberised bitumen, but in regional areas, cold emulsions are quite often preferred, just because they're a lot easier to transport and require less specialised equipment. Every 2 to 3 years, perhaps, in a big batch, when you've got enough of them to make mobilising a crew to your site cost effective, because you spend a lot of money getting a crew to just do 1 or 2 one or two cracks, you really want to give them a fair number to have a go at. So you probably don't do it every week or every 6 months. In terms of patching, just some structural, you might be patching out some structural issues, either with asphalt or some kind of stabilised gravel, which may or may not have a reseal over the top. And again, that's the kind of thing you just do on an as-required basis. I said we'd revisit dealing with a flushed seal. Flushing is probably one of the biggest issues that regional airports, flushing of their seals is one of the biggest issues regional airports will have to consider. Usually related back to sealing runways like their roads or sealing in the colder weather and the use of cutters to allow that to occur. It's really important where you're trying to deal with this if that you understand what actually caused it best we can, or at least have a good educated guess about what caused the flushing, because the treatment you might want is different if it was cutter in the bitumen for cold weather versus just a completely inappropriate seal design because it was safe for a road-based design, or if you've actually got your aggregate pushing into the base course underneath. Different treatments depending on that cause. So you really want to try and spend a bit of time to understand what's causing the flushing before you race in and do something about it. It's extremely difficult to rectify. Resealing over the top of flushed seal is horrendously high risk, and so once you put that option aside and say, well, I've got to do some other option in terms of treating it, they're all expensive. There isn't a simple solution once you've convinced yourself that you can't reseal over the top, which is more likely to be the case than not. In terms of just keeping the runway operational and safe, you can certainly dry rack, so just putting on some additional small size stones and rolling them into the surface. What quite often can happen is that those stones will stay well held during summer, but when you get back to winter, a lot of those stones will sometimes become loose and potentially become small pod, so it does need some management, and that happens usually in winter because the bitumen then hardens back up in winter, and you don't maintain the bond between the stones and the bitumen film that's free on the surface. Water cutting, which is essentially the rubber removing machine, and we'll talk about that a little bit more on the next slide. But the long-term solution quite often is to remove the seal and reseal it, which means you've got to grade the seal off, recompact the base course because it won't be all nice and smooth anymore because you will have damaged it in the removal of the seal, another prime and another seal over the top, almost like it's starting again. Terribly expensive. The other option is to get rid of as much of the excess bitumen as you can and then put a new asphalt surface over the top. And of course, if you've got an asphalt surface, you're probably going to have to groove that asphalt surface, so that also becomes a very expensive option, especially when you remember that asphalt costs 6 to 10 times what a spray seal costs. So avoiding flushed seals is effort well spent, without any doubt. There's a couple of pictures from an airport that did remove flushed seal with a water cutting machine just recently. You can see the big machine there. It's quite a big bit of kit. It's got a whole range of pumps and filters and water supplies in the actual truck itself. And then you've got the little joined by an umbilical cord, the little machine that actually does the removing. And you can see the bottom right-hand corner there, how effective that can be. You've got very flushed seal on the right-hand side of that picture, and the surface almost completely free of excess bitumen on the left-hand side. And that's a photo of a surface that was actually having the flushed bitumen removed in the picture on the left-hand side the night before. So it's an immediate effect. And we actually tested the friction on that before and after, and the friction went from very marginal to through the roof, more than you could ever have to hope or want in terms of friction. So very effective, but also expensive. In terms of asphalt surfaces and their maintenance, again, the typical stuff, joint sealing and crack sealing, the cold joints in particular, so where you've got the transition from one shift to the next shift, or where you've got interfaces to existing pavements that aren't being resurfaced, those cold joints are usually the ones that are most likely to require sealing. And then true, genuine cracks within the paving runs, which will eventually come to the surface sometime through the life cycle of the asphalt overlay. And again, usually best done in batches, just because of the economics of the actual treatment versus the economics of mobilising a crew. A little bit more, in terms of more onerous stuff, you might do some patching just because of an isolated area, either structural or just surface condition. In an asphalt surface, you're going to patch with asphalt. It can be expensive in remote locations. You're not going to get an mobile asphalt plant all the way back again to do a patch, so you're going to be limited by what's locally available. I've seen a few instances lately where people have done a few small patches and then insisted that they be grooved, which I thought was quite unusual. There's quite a bit of guidance that effectively allows you to leave a few isolated patches ungrooved without it being deemed to have compromised the friction or the overall grooved nature of your surface. So all I suggest is that before racing into grooving a patch, just have a think about how big the patch is and where it is and whether that's really necessary or not, because I suspect it's probably not in many cases. As well as all that, then there'll be almost certainly periodic friction testing for some verification that you've still got your surface texture. Depending on your asphalt mix, you might have a mix that gives you the texture without the need to groove, or that your grooves are still effective. And by effective, we really mean that they haven't collapsed or closed, that they haven't been eroded all the way down to their bottom, so their volume isn't sound anymore, or that they haven't been filled up with rubber or some other contaminant, preventing them from doing their job and allowing the water to get out from underneath the tyres as the planes go past. So I think some active verification of groove effectiveness is probably more likely to be required in the future as well, rather than in the past we've just said, well, we've got grooves, they're okay. Probably going to have to verify that they're actually still in a condition that is consistent with the way they're intended to be. The other thing that's particularly in regional airports common on asphalt is surface preservation, commonly referred to as rejuvenation. The idea is that we either slow down or reverse the aging of the bitumen in the surface, which should extend the life of the surface. There's lots of treatments around. I won't talk too much about those. We've talked about them at various AAA events over the years. Two of the misconceptions, though, that I do want to try and I always reiterate, you can treat grooved surfaces. You just have to be careful how you do it. And you can do it without adversely impacting your aircraft operations. You just need to be careful how you go about doing it in terms of picking a product, making sure the application is right, doing it at the right time of the year so that the weather is conducive to curing, and all of those things. So it's not something that you can just do on a whim, but if you plan it well and you do it appropriately, there's no reason to think that it will impact your aircraft operations or safety, and there's no reason why having a grooved runway should prevent you from going down that path. There are plenty of airports who have done preservation overnight, returned their runway to service, and those runways have been grooved well before the preservation was required. You typically expect a preservation treatment at somewhere between 5 and 8 years of age, of the surface age, that is, and it might extend the life of the surface by a couple of years or maybe even more, and the return on investment of that is quite significant if you sit down and do the mathematics. In terms of asphalt overlays, it's the single biggest cost that any regional airport could face from a pavement perspective, short of rebuilding all their pavements for a bigger aircraft. It's usually done in regional areas with the assistance of some grant funding. A lot of planning goes into resurfacing a runway. You're really looking at 12 months worth of geotech survey, designing, going through the contractual stuff, the tendering, and then allowing the contractor enough time to mobilise plant and equipment to site in order to do the work. And again, if you treat your runways like they're roads, you won't necessarily be happy with the outcome. So even in smaller airports, there are some things that need to be different to doing it like a road if you want to get the right answer. And that really brings me to the end of the main bit of the content. Not so many questions today, but usually when I say that, a whole bunch flow in. But it's asked, when removing or getting rid of some old line marking, is it better to black it out or is it better to blast it? That's a good question, and I don't know that either one of those is better. I just think that they're different. I think if you're in a small airport and you don't have access to removing or line marking removal equipment like the water cutter or something similar, then you're probably best off just to black it out because it's very cost effective with a bit of black paint. But you might not want to be doing that every week and having a lot of black paint all over your pavement. So if you've got access to it or you've got a lot of it to do, then actually removing it would probably be a better option. I think it's worth noting there that if you remove line marking with water blasting, which is lower pressure but a high volume of water, then you've got a much higher risk of damaging the underlying surface than if you use like the water cutting type devices, which have got much higher pressure and much lower volumes of water, so they're a lot more controllable and they seem to do a lot less damage to the surface. So depending on where your airport's located, my gut feeling would be just black it out unless you had a very large volume of it to do, or you've done it a lot of times already and you didn't want to continue to add black paint all over your surface. I think blacking it out makes a lot of sense. I was wrong about all the other questions flowing through, so but that's okay. We'll just keep scooting along. I think the important thing to remember is that you build your runway once, and then you might resurface it every 8 or 15 years, depending. But then you're going to do some kind of maintenance probably every other year or two. So even though it's probably seen with a lot lower priority, it's the thing you're going to be worrying about and doing most often. So if you take it seriously and you demonstrate the return on the investment, you'll probably get a lot of advantages and good outcomes. And I also like to caution some from time to time against taking false design savings. So quite often, saving $5 in the planning and the designing of something might end up costing you $10 because you'll either go down a path that isn't actually the optimum path, or you might end up in a contractual situation during construction without having dotted all the I's and crossed all the T's during the design phase. So it's just something that you've seen a bit of lately, is people taking small design savings, but it actually costing them more in the end in terms of the thoroughness of the process that they've been through before they actually physically get to contracting and building something. And that runways aren't roads, and I probably say that more often than I say anything else, I think, in these kinds of sessions. That I would guess that more than half of the issues that I'm asked to have a look at on runways are traced back to the fact that they weren't treated like runways. They were treated like big, long, flat roads. So please And I know that I'm preaching to the converted most of the time in these sessions, but certainly it's a local council habit to not differentiate between roads and runways. Sometimes, not all the time. They're a very generalised statement. So please don't be offended if you're a local council that looks after its airport. Thanks for joining us again. Feedback's always welcome. There's been a couple of discussions with the AAA about the potential to run this as a face-to-face training workshop type event in the future, perhaps in conjunction with some other AAA events that regional airports might be physically at anyway. So that's an option. And we've also had a little chat about once the new MOS is released, some kind of what does the new MOS mean for regional airports, at least from a pavement perspective. So if you think either of those things are good ideas, then please let the AAA people that facilitate those things and collect that kind of feedback know, and then they can consider that in the dueness of time once the MOS is out. Probably after their big national conference, which I suspect consumes all of their attention for the next few weeks at least anyway. Thanks very much.
Thank you to Greg for providing an informative presentation. Thank you also to everyone for participating in today's session. We ask that you now take a moment to complete a short survey that you will be redirected to shortly, directly once available. We encourage you to provide feedback on any other topics that you would like to see covered by emailing events@airports.asn.au. The next AAA webinar is on Wednesday, 25th of September at 11 a.m., an introduction to aircraft noise measurements and metrics, presented by Matt Shepherd from TO70 Aviation Australia. The link to register will be distributed by the AAA shortly, and details will be released in Airport Alert. If you would like additional information, please email AAA Events team on events@airports.asn.au. Thank you and have a wonderful afternoon ahead.